Welcome everybody to the fourth session of the Foundational Crop Scout School. My name is Dane Elmquist. I'm a conservation cropping outreach specialist for UW-Madison Extension. My background is in entomology, and today I'm going to be providing you with a bit of an introduction to basic insect identification, a little bit about sampling and management in a broad sense, and hopefully building on some of the general scouting principles that you've learned earlier. So on behalf of the UW-Madison Division of Extension Crops and Soils program, I thank you for joining us. Okay, so today I'm going to briefly talk about why insects are so successful, then talk about some general insect ID features and strategies you can use for identification. And while we will touch on a few specific insects in the last half of this presentation, I'm not going to spend today telling you how to ID 50 different insect species, because that would be pretty difficult virtually. And the importance of a particular species can really vary annually and regionally. So it's really going to be more useful for you to understand kind of general ID features, and then how to use those in conjunction with resource guides or some other resource that you might have with you in the field. And I'll share some of those at the end. We'll go over a little bit of some sampling techniques, scouting suggestions, how to recognize specific feeding damage, talk a little bit about IPM and thresholds, and then we will use kind of the last half of today to just talk about some major corn, soybean, and alfalfa insects, as well as some beneficials that you might encounter during your scouting work. All right, so on to the importance of insects. Why do we care about insects? Well, basically, we care about them because they're everywhere and there are a lot of them. So there are over 1.5 million insect species that have been described, possibly as many as about 5.5 million total. So about 80% of them remain to be discovered. Insects tend to get a bad rap. Most people are more aware of the few insects that cause problems than they are of the many beneficial or innocuous insects. So out of our roughly, 1.5 million described species, not more than about 1,000 or about 0.1% are really regarded as serious pests. And even fewer of those 1,000 pests are pests of field crops. So it does pay to really be able to accurately identify them when you're out in the field to help inform decisions about management, or to bring back to your farmer or the agronomy company that you're working for. All right, so there are tons of factors that really make insects successful. I've listed just a few of them here. The first one, a really big one, is that their small size really allows them to live in a lot of different niche habitats, allows them to escape predation. They also have a really high reproductive potential and are multi-generational, right? So they can go through 1, 2, 3, up to 18, in some cases, generations per year. So their life cycles are relatively short and their populations can grow rapidly. So think of things like aphids or leafhoppers, right? They're also one of the few animals that can actually fly. This lets them really move effectively toward food and habitat. They can find mates. They can also migrate. They also have a very tough exoskeleton, right? So their skeleton is on the outside of the body, and this helps protect them from attack, minimizes fluid losses, and really makes them strong relative to their own body weight. They are extremely adaptable organisms. They can feed on almost any resource, live in almost any habitat. So if you can think of any type of food resource, there's probably an insect that feeds on it. And there are even insects that can live on the surface of the open ocean. So really quite an amazing group of critters. Unfortunately, in our roles, we often encounter them in a negative light as crop pests. Some beneficials too, and I'll share some information about them as we continue on here. All right, so understanding some basics of insect life cycles is also really important as a crop scout, specifically metamorphosis. So there are two types of metamorphosis. Most insects go through what we call complete metamorphosis, where there are 4 life stages, right? So you have an egg, a larvae, a pupa, and an adult. The larvae usually undergo several molts, which are just kind of like different stages of larval development. Typically, they're getting bigger. The larvae and the adult and insects that undergo complete metamorphosis, they look very different. This allows them to take advantage of different resources at different life stages, which also contributes to their success. Incomplete metamorphosis is another type of insect life cycle. It's a little less common, and these typically only go through kind of 3 life stages: egg, nymph, and adult. Nymphs look very similar to adults, and they often live in the same habitat and feed on the same resources. So here we're thinking about things like aphids, stink bugs, for example. So a big part of scouting, once you're out in the field, right, you encounter an insect or something that maybe is an insect. It's really making the call that that's an insect or not, right? So knowing a little bit about basic insect anatomy is useful. Insects have three distinct body regions: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. So on the head, they have one pair of antennae. This is, they use these for smelling, more or less. The thorax houses the legs and the wings, which help insects move around. And the abdomen houses kind of the digestive and reproductive systems. That's a really kind of basic outline of insect anatomy. There are, for better or worse, a lot of insects that don't exactly follow these rules. For example, flies. They only have one pair of wings. The second pair are modified into kind of a gyroscopic structures called halteres. Immature insects break the rules the most often because they typically don't have any of these identifying structural features, right? Think of something like a caterpillar. So just know that we're going to talk about, identifying the adult forms most frequently. That's what you see a lot of pictures of in keys. But there are some specific immature insects to keep an eye out for that are important here in Wisconsin, and we'll touch on those later. All right, so in the field, if you think you've spotted an insect or possibly captured one in your sweep net, the next thing that you're going to want to do is to look at the wings. Wings are a good kind of evident character that can help you narrow down what type of insect that you're looking at. So many insects out there have what are called membranous wings. Here are some nice examples here. This is a bee wing, an aphid wing, and a dragonfly wing. There are several clear veins in these wings. These veins give structure to the wings and help them fly. Some insects have wings that are, heavily veined, like these dragonflies, whereas aphids, for example, they don't have a lot of veins in their wings. So paying attention to wings is a good key character to check out. You'll often encounter beetles in the field, and some of these are really important crop pests in Wisconsin, like the corn rootworm. Beetles have modified forewings, which are shown here in this middle picture, called elytra, which are basically just hard coverings on the forewings. They do have membranous hindwings that are protected by the elytra. And for beetles, one key character is that the elytra will meet in a straight line down the back. I don't know if you can see this here on the screen, this straight line down the back. One thing to note, this last picture is of a weevil. Weevils are technically beetles, even though they're kind of go by a different common name, and they too have that elytra that meets straight down the back. All right, so true bugs are another big group that you'll encounter. Their forewings are called hemielytra, so half elytra. The top half is tough like an elytra, but the bottom half is membranous. And I bring this up because sometimes it's easy to get true bugs like stink bugs, for example, shown here in the middle picture, confused with bugs like beetles. But a key thing to note is that the hemielytra of the true bugs will cross over the back at the bottom. And you can kind of see that here in this ambush bug picture on the far right side. You can see that these wings cross over at the back on the bottom. Whereas we know for our beetles, right, the elytra, they meet in a straight line down the center. All right, so the next thing when you're in the field, a good thing to try to look at to narrow down what kind of bug you've encountered is the mouth parts. There are tons of different kind of insect mouth parts that can kind of help you narrow down this identification and also try to think about the type of feeding damage that an insect leaves behind. So some critters like beetles, grasshoppers, caterpillars, they have what we call biting and chewing mouth parts called mandibles. So very similar to us humans, but theirs move side to side, whereas ours move up and down. So some good examples of mandibles here on the slide. Others will have what we call piercing and sucking mouth parts, often referred to as a stylet, that they basically use to pierce into the plant tissue and suck up the juices from whatever they're feeding on. So examples here are things like stink bugs, aphids, leafhoppers, mosquitoes. Obviously, they're not eating plant tissue, they're eating us. The stylet is stored kind of tucked away between the head and the thorax, like you can see here on this ventral photo of a stink bug. Here's an aphid stylet poking out into a plant. Here's a nice leaf-footed bug stylet just unrolled there. You can see that the stylet itself is also segmented, which allows it to be folded up and stored. There are also insects with other specialized mouth parts like chewing, lapping, which honeybees have, sponging, which houseflies have, and siphoning, which are found in butterfly moths and adults. But most of our pests are going to be have these kind of chewing, biting mouth parts or piercing, sucking mouth parts. So antennae are also a very important character to note and can be really useful to narrow down an insect, especially if you're using a guide. A lot of times guides or keys are going to talk about antennae and they're going to have, different descriptions for antennae, like some of the terms that you see here: thread-like, beaded, sawtooth, comb-like, abruptly clubbed, etc. So being able to actually, hone in and take note of what the antennae anatomy is going to be very important, especially if you are using a guide trying to narrow down what you're looking at. All right, so hopefully that, kind of really quick general overview of some really key insect characters is useful as you think about identification when you encounter something in the field. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit more towards scouting and sampling. So let's start with a couple basic scouting considerations. One really big one that I really like to stress is you want to be looking for insects before you expect them to be there. It's really critical to have a few zeros on your data sheet recorded so that you know when those insects are arriving into those crop fields, into your systems, so that you can more accurately track that arrival and then track that population development and growth over time. It's also really important for many of the same reasons to use regular sampling intervals. Weekly is a great place to start if possible. Oftentimes that can be prohibitive, so just trying to use some type of regular interval is important. That way you can recognize when populations are changing and then reaching certain thresholds, which are often used to determine course of treatment. So again, we'll talk about thresholds later on here today. As has been mentioned in some of the previous webinars, it's really important to not just avoid certain areas in the field, and especially for insects, don't just scout the edge of the field. A lot of species of insects tend to overwinter or come from grassy areas next to the field. And so when they enter the field at the field edges, they start feeding, right? And so feeding damage can be a lot more severe or a lot worse looking on the field edges compared to the whole field. We refer to these as edge effects. So again, really make sure to walk that whole field, not just scouting out the edges, because things can look a little bit deceiving. As has been mentioned too in previous webinars, walking that whole field using a defined pattern is really critical. We, of course, in Wisconsin prefer the W pattern as seen here, and stop at multiple places within your pattern, sample multiple plants, then average what you find across the whole field. I'll share some resources later on that really describe, in detail for each insect pest, kind of how many plants you should be sampling and where. All right, so some useful things to bring to the field when sampling for insects include a notebook for making observations. Your phone is also a really useful tool for taking pictures of insects or taking pictures of damage that you might encounter. A hand lens is also a really great tool for observing some of the key characters like the wings, antennae, mouth parts, things that we discussed earlier. And also, I like to suggest that folks keep some files on them, or something that allows you to actually collect specimens in the field, bring them back to the office or to the lab, or to preserve them to send off to a diagnostician if necessary. Sometimes, a camera's great, but having the real thing in hand, you really can't beat that. So I recommend these little snap cap vials, other things like old pill containers, a Tylenol bottle, something like that. Those work really well too. And you can always throw those into the freezer at your office or in your kitchen if you want to, and that helps preserve those insects just in case you do need to get them to a diagnostician. Finally, a sampling tool, a sweep net is really critical tool for crop scouts here in Wisconsin. These are nets that are really heavy canvas bags with really kind of heavy duty outer rim that bag sits on. And they're really designed to dislodge insects from plants. I'd highly recommend everybody use a 15-inch diameter sweep net, because this is really kind of a standardized size that allows for consistent and comparable insect sampling, really helps ensure that results from different fields or different times or different people can be reliably compared when monitoring pest populations, especially important in crops like alfalfa. The 15-inch diameter is also a common size that was actually used to develop some of these economic thresholds for pest control. So using that standardized size is pretty important. There are lots of ways to sample for insects. I'm not going to talk about them here today, but we will go over some of them and have some examples at our in-person field days. So shameless plug to sign up for one of those. They include things like sticky cards, pheromone traps, blacklight traps, and in-field plant counts are also really important. This is just when you're going through a field counting insects on plants. So the best method, that you're going to use to sample or collect is really going to vary depending on what crop you're scouting or what insect you're targeting. For example, you're not going to want to use a sweep net. You'll want to use a sweep net for sampling alfalfa weevil, but not a blacklight trap. For soybean aphid, you won't use pheromone traps. You'll be conducting in-field plant counts. So trying to kind of think through what insect you're targeting, what crop you're in, is going to help you make some decisions about what the best method for scouting is going to be. And determining an economic threshold, again, we'll touch on those later, is typically going to require you to be in the field doing some type of either in-field plant counts or sweep nets. And again, the whole goal of insect scouting is to be able to estimate pest density, so number of insects per plant or a number of insects per sweep. And then plant injury from insects is also used in scouting. So things like percent defoliation. Percent defoliation can be kind of tricky to eyeball. And another shameless plug for our in-person field days, we'll have a fun activity that goes over how to do that. And we'll test your skills at how good you are with estimating defoliation. All right, so oftentimes the insects might not be in the field when you're out scouting, so it's going to be important to recognize some of that feeding damage. Think back to our mouthpart discussion, right? Insects with biting and chewing mouthparts are going to be removing plant tissue, defoliating plants, skeletonizing leaves, or clipping pods or stems. So you take a look at the pictures here on this slide. None of these are going to be aphids, right? That's not what aphids do to plants. So here we see like skeletonizing damage from alfalfa weevil, chewing damage from true armyworm, and defoliation from Japanese beetle on our soybean leaves. So insects with piercing sucking mouthparts, like those aphids, like stink bugs and leafhoppers, they're feeding on the plant's phloem, and they leave behind typically stippling or punctures that often cause like a discoloration or a mottling of the plant. Many of these insects, like aphids and leafhoppers, they'll also leave behind kind of a sticky honeydew residue. So here are some examples of piercing sucking damage. On the left here, we see hopper burn on alfalfa, puncture damage and discoloration on corn from stink bugs, and stippling on this plant, in instance, from spider mites feeding. Okay, so now I'm just going to take a few moments to just touch on integrated pest management and the idea of using treatment thresholds to manage pests before we transition into looking at more specific insect ID. So IPM, integrated pest management, it's this idea that you should be able to use multiple proactive tactics to suppress pests. And ultimately, this allows for a more economical and sustainable crop production. So these include tactics that are like cultural tactics, like tillage or plant populations, chemical tactics like the use of an insecticide, and biological control, like conservation biological control, or encouraging and promoting natural enemies within crop fields that are helpful to control pests. So scouting, why I bring IPM up today is because scouting is really a fundamental component of a successful IPM program. IPM, as I kind of alluded to, also accounts for the economics behind pulling the trigger and making a spray application. Are you actually going to get a return on investment from your pesticide application? So this graphic that I included here is kind of a classic in the IPM world. That's why it's actually kind of hard to read, I'm realizing, now that I've blown it up. I should probably take some time to make a better one. It's from a publication back in 1999. But it really describes some of the major components of a successful IPM program. And a lot of them should be familiar to you just based on the last few slides that we've discussed. For example, identification, sampling, Knowledge about the insect's pest behavior and life cycle, also very critical, as is an understanding of population dynamics. So all of these things are, of course, wrapped up in your job as a crop scout. So again, really fundamental to the success of an integrated pest management program. So natural enemies are another critical component of IPM. I've touched on them a couple times, and we'll look in more depth before we'll look at them in more depth before we conclude today. I do want to note that pesticides are also an important component of a successful IPM program, but we typically think about using them as a last resort and only when pests reach a certain threshold. So this kind of approach or philosophy, if you will, is a little bit different behind, say, things just like spraying on a calendar basis, using insurance-based insecticide applications, or simply just throwing something in the tank because, hey, we're going over the field. So some terms that you're going to kind of come across when thinking in an IPM kind of sort of way, and also looking at certain thresholds for insect pests, are going to be economic injury level and economic threshold, especially economic threshold. So for many pests, researchers have really worked out what is the lowest population density that is going to cause economic damage to the crop. And this is what we think of as the economic injury level. The economic threshold is set below that point, below the economic injury level. And this is the point at which action should be taken to avoid reaching that economic injury level. So this can be something like the density of a pest or plant injury, again, like percent defoliation. So here's just kind of a graphical representation of an economic threshold and an economic injury level. And let's just imagine we have a pest whose density follows this black line here on our screen over time. We would want to be making an insecticide treatment after that economic threshold is reached, but before the economic injury level. So it's really critical to be out there in the field scouting, monitoring for pests, so you know when that economic threshold is reached. If you're scouting sporadically or you just get out in the field and you're like, oh, well, here's where my population is at, treating after the economic injury level, that's really too late. Yield is already going to be lost, and the treatment is not going to really recover the cost of the insecticide application at that point. So using thresholds is important for that reason. It also helps minimize input costs and protect beneficial insects, helps prevent flare-ups of other insect pests, and most importantly, using thresholds really helps delay resistance and lets our effective pesticides be used longer. Economic thresholds are listed for a lot of the field crops here in Wisconsin in University of Wisconsin's Pest Management and Wisconsin Field Crops resource. There should be a link in the chat. We'll also touch on that later. We also call it A3646, so it's a reference you might have heard. So a lot of great information about thresholds in that pub. So just a couple of notes, if you do end up having to go out and make a spray, say you've been scouting diligently, hey, this true armyworm, we're past the economic threshold here. It's really important to strive for 100% kill with applications. So don't skimp, use the full rate. Uniform coverage is super important too. So make sure that you're, dialed in on the right nozzles, sufficient volume, right pressure. It's good to know about pre-harvest intervals, especially if you're going to be treating for pest populations that are potentially going to be surpassing economic thresholds later in the season, like soybean aphid, for example. Some pesticides out there have longer, like say 60-day pre-harvest intervals. So just make sure to be always reading the label prior to making any type of application. If possible, and this kind of fits into the IPM framework too, strive for using a pesticide that is a little bit more selective. So something that's not broad spectrum. This will help protect things like your natural enemies. For example, there are insecticides out there that exist that are a little bit more specific, say, towards Lepidoptera or caterpillars, for example. And then make sure to scout afterwards too. There's no getting out of the scouting here today. It's always important to scout afterwards, after that application, just to make sure, it did what you thought it was going to do. You've knocked down that population successfully. You're not seeing any potential flare-ups of secondary pests as well. Okay, so going to use the next, say, 15, 20 minutes here to dive into some specific Wisconsin field crop pests. I'm going to talk today about corn, soybean, and alfalfa. I apologize. We're not going to have time to talk about our wheat pests today, but some of the resources that I'm going to highlight at the end will be useful if you're interested in looking at insect pests of wheat. So I've kind of divided this up here for both corn and soybean as to pests that you're likely going to encounter based on the growth stage of the plant. So we'll talk about kind of the early season kind of soil dwelling pests that are going to be, either pre-emergence or that really early vegetative stage. Then we'll move into vegetative stage and reproductive stage pests. Again, we're going to start with soybean here, just highlighting a couple of important ones to keep an eye out for. All right, so some early season pests that are gonna, dwell in the soil, and there could be a problem in soybean and corn as well. There's a lot of overlap here. Include things like the seed corn maggot, wireworms, and white grubs. A really kind of indicative feature when you're looking at a field that these could be a problem is if there's areas with poor emergence or missing plants, excuse me. So again, conducting stand counts, like Josh talked about a few weeks ago, is going to be an important part of some of the insect pest management and insect scouting stuff too. These pests are typically more problematic under kind of cool, wet conditions as well. So keeping an eye on the weather might help you think about what you're seeing out there in the field. So quickly going through these here, white grubs, these are the larvae of beetles. Oftentimes they can live for multiple years in the soil. They're identified by their kind of C shape, as you can see here, and this kind of really robust head capsule, and you'll actually be able to see those mandibles on that insect as well. They can be a problem in fields that are planted like into sod or that are coming out of CRP land. They really like to live on grasses. So again, kind of a plug for collecting a lot of that field history information, like Liz talked about in our first webinar here. Getting as much of that information as possible will also help you think about your insect scouting in a little bit more of a clear manner. Wireworms are another early season soil dwelling pest. They're a complex of beetle species that are long lived. And again, they can be problematic in fields that are following sod or CRP land. Seed corn maggot, which is this last one here, you can see the larvae there boring into a soybean cotyledon. They are typically going to show up when cover crop or manure has been applied to a field and then incorporated via tillage. That incorporation process tends to chop up plants or chop up some of that organic residue like manure and releases these volatiles or these smells. That causes the adults to show up. They lay their eggs in the incorporated residue and the larvae hatch and typically start to feed on the germinating seeds or developing seedlings. All right, so moving on here to our vegetative stage pest for soybean to highlight here. This is one that we sometimes see in Wisconsin. This is the bean leaf beetle. And this is one of the first insects that you might encounter on soybean. There are lots of variations as to what this beetle looks like. That's what you're looking at here in this bottom picture with the blue background. Looking yellow with black spots to yellow with no spots, all the way down to red with spots. They can be about 1/4 inch long, again, ranging in color, but the really key diagnostic character is this triangle behind the head on the top of the elytra here. Regardless of what kind of color you're looking at, they're all going to have that triangle behind the head. So a really key diagnostic character for knowing that you're looking at bean leaf beetle, regardless of the color. They're really likely to be found in higher numbers on earlier planted soybeans compared to late. It is a defoliator and can transmit a virus, which is of greater concern in southern Wisconsin compared to northern Wisconsin. So kind of where you're located is something to think about when you're out there scouting as well. The bean leaf beetles, they tend to chew round holes between the major leaflet veins, as you can see in this picture down here. And this damage is easily distinguished from that of like caterpillars or grasshoppers, which really chew like these irregular, ragged holes in the plants. So scouting for overwintered beetles should begin shortly after soybean emergence. And typically this is done, you go out and you count the number of beetles you find on each plant sampled, obtain a field average. And the economic threshold for this guy is a little bit different. It depends on the growth stage of the plant and the commodity price of the plant at that time too. So again, those are all listed in tables in that A3646 document. All right, so moving on to a reproductive stage pest here, soybean aphid. This is the big one in soybean. They're really small. They're about 1/16 of an inch long, green to yellowish color. They're really the only colonizing aphid that we're going to find on soybean. And they have 15 generations per year. So they tend to show up kind of early in the field, but they're not at a damaging level. So it's recommended to avoid treating soybean aphids when they first appear in the field. And this is why regular scouting is critical, right? Scouting weekly to determine the rate of population increase. And then treatment is recommended when approximately 80% of the field has reached an average of 250 aphids per plant, and that population is actively increasing. So natural enemies here are a really important component of soybean aphid management, particularly parasitoid wasps. Parasitoid wasps will lay eggs essentially inside these aphids, and then the developing wasp larvae kills the host from within. That adult wasp emerges, then leaving behind kind of a hollowed out shell of a husk, what we call aphid mummies. So that's what you're seeing right here. This is an aphid mummy on a soybean plant. The parasitized mummies are usually like a tan to dark brown, and they're usually stuck to the underside of soybean leaves. Sometimes you can actually see the parasitoid emergence hole. So again, keep an eye out for these when you're scouting, and make note. It's a good thing to be thinking about when you're like trying to determine what the population dynamics of this pest in the field are, and if you should be thinking about a treatment if you're getting close to that economic threshold. Okay, so a couple other soybean insects to throw out there. Stink bugs, painted lady caterpillars, green clover worms, Japanese beetles. These are all defoliators, and they can be, except for stink bugs, excuse me. Stink bugs is a piercing, sucking mouth part. But the rest of them, especially Japanese beetle, are defoliators. They can be issues in soybean. I'm not going to touch on them today, but again, there'll be some resources that you can look at to get some more information on those pests. One thing I do want to note is soybean gall midge. To date, soybean gall midge has not been found in Wisconsin. However, it will be very important to confirm the presence of this potential pest in the state. So I figured I'd mention it to those who are going to be out there on the front line, so to speak. The larvae are translucent at first, but they turn orange when they mature. So you can kind of see that here in this picture down here, translucent larvae turning orange. The swollen stems of soybean plants are galls, which you can see in this A right here. And darkened feeding sites are usually kind of the first symptoms of injury. And to help confirm soybean gall midge injured plants, look for the larvae, and the location of the feeding site should just be above ground level. I mention this because there is another very similar larvae, the white mold gall midge, which is a different species and has been found in Wisconsin. They're very similar in appearance to soybean gall midge, but they're not really considered an economic pest. So white mold gall midge prefers areas of the soybean plant which are compromised by disease or other injury, and these sites are usually found in the upper portion of the plant. So very different from that soybean gall midge feeding site, which is going to be very close to that the soil surface. The closest known infestation of soybean gall midge to Wisconsin is in Rice County, kind of in like south central, southeast Minnesota. So just something I figured folks should be aware of when you're out there looking at plants. All right, we're going to move into corn here relatively quickly. So there are some similar soil-dwelling pests like we saw for soybean, the wireworms, the seed corn maggots. I'm not going to kind of recap that. Very similar information as to what we just went over there. I'm going to focus first on some stand reducers, particularly some moths that can be a problem in early vegetative stages, namely the true armyworm and the black cutworm. So these moths can cause really severe damage from emergence, usually up until the V5, V6 stage of corn. They both migrate up to Wisconsin from the southern United States, kind of along the Gulf Coast in the spring. And they're insect pests that we really should be scouting for basically right now as corn is emerging and is in those early vegetative stages. The most common cutworm pest in Wisconsin is the black cutworm. These moths have about 1.25 inches to a 2-inch wingspan as adults, so they're relatively decent sized moths. The forewings are kind of a dark brown to dark black with a really distinct black dagger marking near the tip of the forewing. This feature is really diagnostic and can make black cutworm adults relatively easy to recognize compared to other moths that you might encounter. The larvae shown here, they vary in color from really light gray to nearly all black. They kind of have like a greasy or greasy sheen to them, and the head is a really dark brown. The larvae typically go through 6 to 7 instars, depending on temperature. and resource availability, and they'll grow to a length of about 1.5 inches when they're about ready to pupate. So young cutworms are going to be found feeding on corn foliage, and early detection of this injury will give you time to treat before really extensive cutting occurs. So for this reason, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to get out there and start monitoring fields as plants emerge. Checking for signs of leaf feeding, cutting, wilting, or missing plants within the stand is kind of a key clue that, oh, maybe cutworm is out in this field. The cutworms are going to start to cut plants when they're in that little bit of a later developmental instar, usually the fourth instar or later. And treatment is going to be suggested when about 2 to 5% of the plants have been cut. And that's based again off scouting 100 plants in a field. All right, so moving on to another stand reducer here. This is the true armyworm, another caterpillar moth. The adult moths are beige. Their wingspan is about 1.5 inches at its biggest, so a little bit smaller than black cutworm. They're identifiable by this distinct white dot here on the forewing. And true armyworm larvae are going to have this dark black stripe surrounded by kind of variable orange or white stripes on the body, and then this kind of orange-brown head with some kind of black markings, almost looking like netting on that head capsule. So first generation armyworm infestations, again, these are guys that are migrating up from the south, are usually present in June, and they can be found kind of by scouting the field margins for some really telltale feeding damage, which is this picture here on the slide, which is corn leaves with ragged edges. Irregular, ragged chewing patterns along that leaf edge is really a telltale sign of armyworm feeding. And closely checking corn plants for larvae and frass, which is just another term for caterpillar poop in the whorls, is another really good thing to do just to give yourself some confidence that you are seeing true armyworm feeding on that corn. If you find signs of feeding, it's really important, again, to scout that field thoroughly. Check 5 sets of 20 plants at random. So 100 plants total in that field, walking that W pattern. Record the number of damaged plants, the number of worms per plant. And when you find 2 or more armyworms that are, perhaps 1 inch or smaller per plant on 25% of the plants, or 1 armyworm larvae that is larger than 1 inch on 75% of the plants, then it's time to consider, that's the economic threshold, it's time to consider some treatment. We think about the size of the worms here for a specific reason, because if the armyworms are really large and they're going to start to pupate soon, they're going to stop feeding. So they're going to be less of a problem. Spraying that insecticide is not going to do much. Finding the worms while they're still small, while they're young, and before that damage is really severe, really will increase the value of your control. So yeah, young worms are easier to control than those near maturity. And for each of these moths, black cutworm and true armyworm, some recent work that we've done here in Extension has looked at the effect of potentially planting like a rye cover crop prior to corn. And we've noticed that there is some potential for more of these moths to be present around those fields. So again, pays to know a little bit about that field history, about that management, and just more reason to do a thorough job when you're getting that information. All right, so moving on here to the big one, the billion-dollar bug, corn rootworm. Throughout most of the north-central USA, corn rootworm is the most concerning corn insect pest. The larvae are the damaging stage of this pest typically, although adults can cause some problems occasionally. You can actually look for larvae directly, typically about mid-June to early July by digging in the soil. But the best way to scout for them is to actually dig up corn roots, look at the damage during this time period. This can be usually done around tasseling up into the mid-reproductive stage. And this is a good time where you can be thinking or working with your farmer or your agronomist to really validate your corn rootworm management decisions by checking out root damage. So there are 2 species of corn rootworm that we're really concerned with, primarily the northern and the western corn rootworm. The larvae look essentially the same. They're small. They have this darkened head capsule up here. This is a really way to distinguish corn rootworm larvae from other beetle or fly larvae that you might find in the soil. Their feeding causes this root pruning here, which may ultimately lead to corn lodging in severe instances, and that's a very serious issue. All right, so the Western corn rootworm have yellow and black elytra, so these are beetles. They're usually striped, like you can see here in this picture, but sometimes there's a lot of variation, so there could be like a black smudge along the back. We'll take a look at a picture in a second here. Northern corn rootworm, again, tend to be green, but a lot of variation. Sometimes they're a little bit more of a brown or yellow occasionally. So there are some lookalikes out there, specifically for Western corn rootworm. The striped cucumber beetle can be confused for a Western corn rootworm adult. The stripes are on a cucumber beetle are typically much better defined than the Western corn rootworm, and really critically, their body, the abdomen underneath the elytra, they're black, whereas the Western corn rootworm body is going to be like a lighter kind of pale yellow, as you can see here in this photo. So if you're scouting to determine your risk of corn rootworm damage for the next year, then you're going to be scouting for adults. Usually this is going to occur in July or August, maybe a little bit later, typically done using pheromone traps, but this can also be accomplished by counting beetles on plants. So if beetle numbers average, about 0.75 is typically the threshold or more per plant during August, the use of a corn rootworm control tactic like a soil insecticide or a Bt corn rootworm hybrid is recommended if corn is going to be planted again in that field the following year. Crop rotation is definitely still the best strategy to help control corn rootworm. Control of adult corn rootworm, as I mentioned earlier, is usually not necessary, but occasionally they can be a problem with silk clipping during pollination. And so if your goal is to protect silks during pollination, a treatment may be justified. Excuse me, if those populations reach more than 5 corn rootworm beetles per plant, the silks are clipped to within a ½ inch of the husk, and pollination is less than 50% complete. So here's another just kind of nice picture showing the incredible variation that can be present in the northern and corn rootworm beetles here. So something to keep an eye out for. They're all not going to look picture perfect like we've seen in our textbooks. All right, so the last corn insect I'm going to highlight here, which is a problem again during the reproductive stage. It's an ear feeder. This is the Western bean cutworm. Adult moths do not damage corn, but the larvae will feed on tassels, silks, corn ears, ultimately causing reduced grain quality and yield. And this is usually actually due to the secondary pathogens and mold that take advantage of this ear feeding damage. So the moths, adult moths are about 3/4 of an inch long, so they're smaller, gray-brown to color. The male and females have this kind of distinguishable cream-colored striped or bar on the outside of the forewing, circular spots in the middle, and then this almost kind of boomerang-type mark here at the forewing tip. So for Western bean cutworm, you're actually going to be scouting for the egg masses, which is a picture I've included here on the slide, because the larvae, they quickly hatch and then they tunnel into the ear. When first moths are detected in a pheromone trap in your area, we'll share some resources for pheromone traps here in Wisconsin at the end. It's recommended that you're scouting about a minimum of 20 consecutive corn plants in 5 locations for these egg masses, which are typically going to be found on the upper surfaces of new leaves, as well as in leaves that really haven't unfolded both above and below the ear zone. And it's recommended to treat when 5% of the plants scouted have these egg masses present. Again, all these numbers and thresholds that I'm throwing at you are going to be available in that A3646 resource we'll share. All right, so just a quick plug for another pest, technically not insects, slugs. So slugs are mollusks, and they're another pest to take note of. They're mostly problematic in conservation cropping systems that use practices like cover crops and no-till. They really like the residue left on the soil surface and can be most economically damaging at these early crop growth stages, especially during a wet spring followed by mild winter. A great example of that is the winter that we had in 2024, and slugs were a major issue in several field crops and dairy systems in Wisconsin in 2024. We heard a lot about them here at Extension. They're typically more of a concern in soybean compared to corn. The soybean growing point is above ground, whereas the corn growing point is below ground until about that V4, V5 stage. So soybean, you can have some more economically damaging circumstances, soybean with slugs. Slugs feed using what's called a radula. which is basically you can think of as like a tongue with a ton of teeth on it. They use this radula to scrape plants, and they often leave what's called a window painting type of damage. And it's usually accompanied by a slime trail, like you can see on this corn leaf here. So they also cause pretty distinctive pitting on soybean cotyledons, which you can see here in this picture. And this can lead to some serious instances of stand loss. As I mentioned, they're an increasingly challenging pest in Wisconsin as we move towards more conservation-based cropping systems, and in the era of global environmental change as Wisconsin winters start to change over time. So our team at Extension has some ongoing projects to learn more about this pest. Our knowledge in Wisconsin is lacking a little bit. So check out that link if you want to know a little bit more info about slugs. All right, so now on to alfalfa. There are two major pests of note here that I'm going to cover. Alfalfa weevil, primarily a problem earlier in the season, and potato leafhopper, which can be an issue later in the season. So alfalfa weevil, again, are an early season insect pest. They're feeding on alfalfa leaves and may severely damage that first crop and sometimes second crop alfalfa fields. So the larvae are legless. There's a nice shot of them here. They've got that black head capsule, and a really diagnostic character is they'll have this white stripe basically starting at the head capsule moving along their back. They're typically going to be active in May to June. The alfalfa weevil adults, they're really small, about 1/4 of an inch. Gray-brown snout beetles, so these are those weevils, as the name implies, and they've got a really distinct kind of V-shaped or shield-shaped structure on their elytra, and also a little bit on the thorax as well. Again, really good diagnostic character for our adult alfalfa weevils. So threshold for treatment is based on defoliation, so not like sweep net or plant counts. And that threshold is 40% of the alfalfa stems have alfalfa weevil damage, and the field is more than 7 days from the scheduled harvest or cutting date. So there have been some recent resurgences of alfalfa weevil as a problem in the Midwest. This is possibly due to pesticide resistance or maybe decreasing natural enemy populations that can otherwise keep them in check. So again, just a real need for scouting and using insecticides only when necessary when thinking about alfalfa weevil. All right, so potato leafhopper, the last insect we're going to touch on here today. Potato leafhoppers are tiny green true bugs, so they go through that incomplete metamorphosis. They feed by piercing the plant tissues with their piercing sucking mouthparts, extracting that plant sap. In Wisconsin, potato leafhoppers will migrate up from the Gulf of Mexico, starting to arrive in about April, but the economically damaging populations are not usually present until like the second or third cutting of alfalfa, usually June to August, late June to August. So they're multi-generational, right? So these populations are building up over the season. Adult leafhoppers are really small. They're like 1/8 of an inch long or smaller. They're green, wedge-shaped. They've got 6 white spots behind the eyes. So another good character to take out your hand lens and take a look at. Their body's widest at the head. It's going to taper downwards, and the wings are going to be extending past the abdomen. All stages have a piercing, sucking mouth parts. They're going to jump quickly when disturbed, and adults can fly because they've got those wings. The immature stages, which are called nymphs, look very, very similar to the adults. They're pale green to yellow, but they don't have wings. And the damage that potato leafhoppers leave behind may result in stunted growth, yellowing of the leaves, which we see here. That's that characteristic hopper burn, and reduced forage quality. So regular scouting, again, is essential for this pest. And to determine if there are potato leafhoppers in the field, it's recommended to use a sweep net, take 20 consecutive sweeps at 5 different locations in the field using that 15-inch diameter sweep net. Economic thresholds are based on the average number of leafhoppers per sweep and on the plant height. So taller plants are going to have a higher treatment threshold because they can withstand more damage and will be cut sooner than shorter plants. All right, so just as we start to wrap up here, just want to point out, most of the insects that you're going to encounter in the field are actually probably not going to be pests. These are known as beneficial insects. These critters provide really valuable ecosystem services like biological control, pollination, and decomposition. Some of the predators or natural enemies that provide biocontrol that you might encounter are shown here. Quickly just walk through some of these. So syrphid fly larvae, also known as hoverfly larvae, very voracious natural enemies. Minute pirate bugs, as their name implies, they're very, very small, but again, a really great sign to see these guys in our fields. Solitary wasps are also excellent natural enemies. So now when somebody asks you, what are wasps good for? You've got a nice answer for them. Parasitoid wasps, again, we touched on those a little bit when talking about soybean aphid, ambush bugs, green lacewings, also predators as larvae and as adult, and then ground beetles too. I've got a nice video here of a ground beetle snacking on a corn earworm caterpillar. Ground beetles are really great natural enemies. Typically, they're present on the soil surface, so they're more involved in controlling pests that dwell on the soil surface or are pests of early vegetative seedlings. They can be really, really important slug predators as well. All right, so as we wrap up here, we're going to get into a little bit of resources. A great resource for field crop insects in the Midwest comes from Iowa State. I'd highly recommend everyone get a copy of this if they can. I think it's like $5. It contains description and images of more than 50 pests and beneficial insects. Really digestible, nice thing to keep in the truck. So as you know from this presentation, there's a lot of insects out there. Fortunately, UW Extension has some really great resources that show which insect pests you're most likely to encounter at a certain time of year for corn, soybean, and alfalfa. So check the link below to get these documents. Again, this is just really useful for kind of honing in on, okay, I'm out here in May. What really should I be looking for? All right, and I know I just threw a ton at you. And now I'm going to hopefully provide some good resources that you can check out that are going to, build on what we've touched on today and really help you in the field and as you prepare for scouting. Also a plug just again to attend the in-person days where we're going to have a chance to look at some real insects, practice some sampling techniques to test your knowledge. First resource, which I've mentioned quite a bit today, has a lot of information about those economic thresholds, specific insecticides, et cetera, is the 2025 Pest Management in Wisconsin Field Crops A3646. Definitely take a look at that. It's a really nice PDF, well put together, easy to navigate. A lot of great information in there, a lot of nice tables that walk you through economic thresholds to help you think about certain treatment decisions. I'd highly recommend also signing up for Dr. Emily Bick's Digital Entomology Lab Insect Pest Text Alert Service to find out what insect pests are emerging and active in fields near you. This is usually a text update right to your phone, just to give you an idea of like, hey, I'm going out scouting today. This is what I should be keeping an eye out for. The Vegetable Disease and Insect Forecasting Network is a free tool for folks in Wisconsin that currently includes plant insect growing degree day models to help you kind of anticipate the onset of increased pest risk using these predictive degree day models. For example, this is a map I pulled off of the website yesterday showing risk for alfalfa weevil. So the parts of the state are in red or at very high risk. Alfalfa weevil is abundant and already feeding there. So if you're in Madison, hey, they're already out there doing damage. But say if you're up in Antigo, there's a lower risk right now. And so it might pay to get out there and do some scouting or at least help inform some of your scouting decisions. The DATCAP Pest Survey Network is also a really amazing resource. This is a network of pheromone traps. I mentioned pheromone traps a few times, especially when we're referencing moth pests. Excellent reference or resource to use for looking at weekly updates and counts for certain moth pests to help determine scouting activities. And for really tough IDs, something that's in that SnapCap file you can't quite figure out, consider using the University of Wisconsin Insect Diagnostic Lab. This service was founded in the late 70s to provide timely and accurate IDs for insects in Wisconsin. And finally, rely on us, your UW-Madison Extension Crops and Soils team. Your regional educators and statewide specialists are an excellent resource to help you out during your scouting career. All right, so with that, I'm wrapping up here. Please consider to scan this QR code or follow the link in the chat to complete our evaluation survey. Let us know where we can improve and how we can help you out in the future with more content like this. And I went a little long. I apologize. I will take some questions if there are any.
Dane, I see one in the chat. How do you determine the interval between application of insecticide and rescouting for efficacy after the fact?
Oh yeah, that is a really great question. So a lot of these insecticides are going to be contact insecticides, so they're going to actually have to contact the insect to or the insect will have to contact them one way or the other to do their job. So most of them are going to be relatively quick acting for the most part. So I would say you wouldn't have to deviate too much from like your weekly scouting schedule. So if, for example, you sprayed, it would pay to go back 7 days later. I don't think you need to rush back out into the field 24 or 48 hours after that, especially if there might be some concern about actually um, encountering that insecticide spray. But yeah, that's a really great question. I would recommend that you don't really deviate too much from your normal schedule. I wouldn't wait 2 or 3 weeks. You'd want to get in there, about a week after. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or any of our crops and soils team. We'd be happy to answer any insect questions that you may come up with. Wishing you the best scouting this season.